He was 18 months old. I knew nothing about what I was doing. Back in the day, Golden Horseshoe had completely different owners, and they had John Lyons VHS tapes on how to train your horse. Anybody remember those? So I sat and watched those and took a lot of bumps and bruises trying to figure out how to train him. Ended up being the most fantastic horse I've ever had. So, and I do this in honor of him. If anybody goes to my website, which is saddlesandbalance.com, it has a lot of information about how I do everything, talks about my heart horse Dutchman. And I kind of wanted as kind of like a little trick. So I have this really cute picture. And this is my daughter and I as a little one on my heart horse. And I have this on my computer at work, and I was looking at it the other day, and I thought, it is such a cute freaking picture. But when I looked at it, I thought, oh my God, it's glaringly obvious that there's a few things wrong. But I didn't know that back then, for as young as I was then. So I was kind of hoping that maybe at the end of this, after I've talked about all of this, that maybe you guys could point out a few things that I think are so obviously wrong in this picture. So hopefully I can get you some good information. I do saddle fitting on English and Western. The schooling that I went through was extremely extensive. We had to learn everything about when saddles were first started back in BC. We had to learn all about human anatomy, that men's pelvises and women's pelvises are completely different. We are made very different. How we sit in the saddle is very different. Their balance alignment point is in a very different place than what our balance alignment point is. Our hips come out in a different direction than what out of the sockets than what theirs do. So how we sit in the saddles is very different. Surprisingly, most Western saddles seem to be fitted for men. So women do have a lot of problems with the Western saddles. So we can talk about some of those things. And then there's some things about the English saddles that are not so great, but we'll talk about the good things and the bad things. But my schooling took about 1.5 years for me to complete. I have a full-time job. We had to do what was called an externship, where I then had to do evaluations on 30 different horses. My person that I dealt with was in Germany, so we would have 4 a.m. Zoom phone conferences and everything. So it took a long time, but it was very worthwhile. I'm very happy and very proud of the extensive education that I got through that schooling. So with my evaluations, the one thing Elizabeth alluded to is how thorough I am, and that's because I have an 11x17 sheet that covers everything from the horse, the rider, and the saddle, and then has tracings of the horse that then you can then take to either a manufacturer or Golden Horseshoe, a tack shop, and help yourself, help to find a saddle. And I never disappear from my clients. My ultimate goal is to make sure that you and your horse are happy. I'm really glad that everybody is here tonight. That means to me that you care about your horse, and that's why I do this. When I got my first saddle, I just remember it was at, I don't even remember where the first one came from. I got a second one at PFI down in Springfield. And I remember just looking at it going, this is really cool looking. And you just throw it on. Now there's way too much information out there to be able to do that anymore. We can't just throw it on. You can't throw on a saddle on, and own 10 different horses and expect it to fit every horse. It's kind of the same as a pair of jeans. Just because your jeans might fit your friend doesn't mean that they're going to fit you. So, the saddles do need to be tailored to the horse and the rider. It's just as important that your saddle fits you as it does your horse. There are too many people that say, well, I don't care about myself, I want it to fit my horse. Well, if you're out of balance and the saddle doesn't fit you, it's going to then put the horse out of balance. So it's really important that they both are, you, the saddle, and the horse are all working together. So So given that, when I start my evaluation, what the first thing, and I know some of you are kind of far back there, so I'll try and explain this as best I can. The first thing I do is I always try to find the edge of their scapula, and that's going to be just right in front of their withers. Finding the edge of your scapula is really important, because what you want is your scapula to be able to be kind of like a sliding glass door with your saddle. You want it to be on an even track. You don't want it hitched up. You want that scapula, that shoulder blade, to be able to slide up and under that saddle. You know, that scapula attaches to the humerus down here, and when it angles up, it's almost kind of like a train wheel. It'll go up and back, and you want that scapula to easily slide underneath that saddle. So when we are putting our saddles on the horses, whether it's your Western or English, on your Western, you want your front concho, because that is typically where the front edge of your tree is. So you want your concho, or on your English saddle, you want your D-ring to then be sitting behind the edge of that scapula. We all have a habit of putting our saddles on too far forward. A lot of times that might be because of our rigging or girth. I'm sure there's English people here too. That if the rigging is sitting too far back, then we want to then move the saddle forward so that it's more where it needs to be. Once we start moving that too far forward, then we're actually putting the saddle on top of the shoulder. The shoulder doesn't have the ability to then really move. So that's why it's important, when you are putting your saddle on, to find the edge of that scapula and making sure that either your D-ring or your concho is sitting behind that. So this other line is typically the largest part of the shoulder, and the largest part of the shoulder is always what you want to fit your saddle to. Because it's like putting on too tight of a pair of jeans. You want them to be able to fit right. That largest part of the shoulder is going to guide you on how big of a tree your saddle needs. And always keep in mind that when we're talking about trees, we not only have the width of our gullet. Everybody gets, I think, really focused on, as far as on the Western, semi-quarter horse bars or quarter horse bars or whatever. Everybody always really focuses on the gullet size, but you not only have just the gullet, but then you have the angles. So, and both of them are extremely important. So you want your gullet, and you want your gullet to be able to accommodate the large part of that shoulder. And then your angles, you want to be able to then fall with the same angle as the shoulder of the horse. Some little tricks that you can do is you can take a pen and put it on the horse's, the large part of their shoulder, put your saddle on, and put a second pen on the front edge of your saddle, and stand at their neck and see, are your pens in parallel alignment? And if they're not, if one's going like, if the pen on the saddle is doing that or that, then your angles on that saddle aren't matching the angle of your shoulder. So then the next part that I then look at is then the 18th rib. So a little trick to find your 18th rib, if sometimes if we've got some chubbiness going, this is a big fatty area right here if they're a little bit on the chubby side, and sometimes finding that 18th rib is pretty hard. So we all know that pattern of their hair that, I'm sorry, I have my back to you. The pattern of their hair, if it rains, the way that water falls down in that pattern where the hair is coming from that direction and that direction, your 18th rib is typically about in that area. Just made me think our horses are probably outside, so now I'm going to fret over whether my horses are okay. So that's a little trick to finding your 18th rib. If you're not able to find that, you can look at where that hair pattern joins. Find that 18th rib, and some people talk about going straight up with that rib, and you can't. The horse's ribs curve just like ours curve, which you can see in this picture over here. So when you find that 18th rib, you have to keep moving your fingers and following that rib up. If you go straight, you're already going into their lumbar area. So you find that 18th rib because that puts you at the back end of their thoracic area and staying off from the lumbar region, which I know this is probably too little for any of you in the back to see. So the lumbar region is really, really important that we stay off from that because it's a series of bones that stick straight out. They're paper thin. Ovaries and kidneys aren't too far down there. And once we start bouncing around on that, it's pretty uncomfortable and can be very painful. Horses have a variation of their pain tolerance. Some will withstand it and not, tell you. Some will send you flying because another nickname for it is the bucking reflex point. So it's really important that we stay off their lumbar area. And staying off their lumbar area means the tree. So I'm going to just kind of keep bouncing around a little bit here. So on our English saddle, do we have any English riders here tonight? Awesome. So on our English saddle, you want to make sure that your panels from the front to the back are, the back end of your panels are staying off from that lumbar area. Sometimes the panels have a really nice curved relief to them. So you're not always looking at the very dead end of your panel. You have to look at where the actual weight placement is, where the weight's going to be pressing down on the horse. So that's on the English saddle. Then on the Western saddle, the back end of the Western saddle, where your back end of your cantle meets the saddle is typically where your tree ends. So skirting is all cosmetic. You don't have to worry about, anything on the skirting other than it, being too close maybe to your hip joint. But you want to make sure that the back end of your cantle is staying off and the back end of your panel is staying off that lumbar area. It's just a big source of pain for them. So then, which is why I have a nice big old X here that I typically draw here, so that way you're staying off that area. So from that 18th rib to the back edge of the scapula is what we could then call the saddle support area. The saddle support area is what we want our tree to be sitting on. Horses are not made for us to ride on them. The vertebrae on their back are not round like ours are. They actually have a little bit of like a shark fin on them, which is shocking that we actually sit on them, and especially even bareback. But on each side of that little so-called shark fin is a little muscle on each side of that, and they're really it's called a multifidus muscle, and they're really delicate muscles. You have all of the nerves that are coming out of the spine. So next to the spinous processes of the spine are those little muscles. Then adjacent to that muscle is then called the longissimus muscle. That's the only muscle that is then meant to carry us. And that is the muscle that it's a nice thick muscle, and it goes from the back edge of the scapula to that 18th rib. So we want to make sure that the tree of our saddle is sitting on that saddle support area. So we've got shoulder room, and then we've got, plenty of room that we're then off from the lumbar area. The next area is what's called their wither cap. And that's about from the back edge of that scapula to about where the wither connects with the back. The wither cap area is really important. If you have a saddle that's too tight and is almost kind of doing a closed pinning on the top of the horse, once you start pinching there, then they don't want to extend their legs. They start hollowing out. Once you hollow out, as we all know, then the legs are getting out. They're not getting underneath. They're not getting their thoracic sling area, and they're not getting engaged. And once you start hollowing out, then we can then start going down the path of possible kissing spine later on down the road if they are spending way too much time with that back hollowed out. And I always tell my clients it's kind of the same as if I take my finger and poke you in the center of the back. your reaction is going to try and then get away from that. And that's actually what they're doing. So when we're pinching, when that saddle's pinching on that wither cap area, they're arching their back and trying to get away from it, just like what we would do if I were poking you in the back. So, so the wither cap, we need to make sure that the saddle has got some good clearance. We like to get a 2 to 3 finger, preferably 3 finger clearance from the underside of your gullet to the top of your wither. Same with the English saddle. And then on to the side, you want about a finger width to the side of that wither, and then following again down on that angle. So then my next line here, this is the latissimus line. This is their lat, like what we've got back here. And the latissimus is kind of tricky, comes about 2 inches off their humerus bone. Now I'm going to start getting too technical here, and it comes across. Their latissimus is another muscle that is just delicate for them, and if we're girthing up, then we want to make sure that the buckle of our girth is either above the latissimus or below it, so that the buckle's not rocking on that. There's another line down here. This is another muscle that's in the thoracic sling area. If anybody here rides dressage, some of our dressage cinches are really, they're a short girth, so some of those buckles can then sit on that muscle down there. So there's kind of a lot going on in this area. So that kind of then leads to the next part of our girths. So the thing to keep in mind is that on a horse, behind their elbow, this is where the horse balances themselves. This is also the quietest part of the horse. So in the rodeos, when the guys are, going to ride the bucking broncs and they're wiggling up, they're wiggling up so that they can get in that same balance line as the quietest part of the horse. So we want to make sure that when we're girthing up, we're behind the elbow, and the end of their sternum is actually a bone that kind of sticks down, and we want to make sure that we're before the end of that sternum, so we're in that quiet part. Once we start girthing up back here, you're going to end up running into problems, because this is also the smallest part of them. If you're girthing back up here, you have a pretty good chance of that girth then moving forward, and then probably loosening up on you. If you have a cinch on your saddle that the rigging is set really far back, ideally you want your rigging to be able, when you put the saddle up, you want your rigging, or whether it's the English, you want your billets to be able to hang as perpendicular as they can, and in that quiet spot, the balance point of the horse. Once your rigging or your billets get too far back and you're having to pull them forward into that quiet area, you're then pulling the saddle forward and pulling it into the back edge of that shoulder. So, and that, again, that goes back to them being able to move their shoulder, free and clear under that saddle. So, so that's what all of those lines mean. Anybody have any questions about that so far? Yeah.
2 to 3 inches of space underneath that horn in the saddle.
Yep.
So what height, what point are you calling something? The girth padding? Is it to that padding, the top of that yellow padding?
So you're talking about the finger clearance?
Yeah. What am I measuring the top? Where is the top?
So the top is going to be the top of their withers.
Not there on the saddle. What is the top you're talking about?
Right underneath your gullet.
So the actual leather.
Yep, the actual leather.
2 to 3 inches from that leather to that.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And then 1 inch was.
1 inch will be on the side of their wither. So when it's sitting down on the horse, of course the horse is going to be coming up a little bit here. You want about a finger width alongside of that. So you want 2 to 3 fingers to the top of their wither, to the underside of your gullet, and a finger width on the side of that.
Oh, a gap in there.
You want just a little bit of a gap there. Yep. Yep.
And that's just to where that fleecing.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. And that'll be the same for English and Western. I don't mean to keep focusing on Western. They're both pretty similar. So if anybody has any specific questions about the English, please speak up.
And I'm starting to do center fire rigging.
Okay.
And you talk about that because I don't think your front needs to be perpendicular at the front. Is that correct?
Well,
why?
So on that center fire rigging, you still want, even though you're looping to the back, to that back rigging, you still want to be able to get that front in that quiet part.
Okay, so point to the quiet part on your picture.
So the quiet part's here, and if you're doing that center fire rigging, your loop is probably about here, right? So you're still going to set up that center fire from here.
And your girth?
You want your girth here, and then your center fire can still go back to there.
And your lowest point, where it goes underneath the bottom of the horse, it's all the way up in the front?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I mean, you don't want it right up against the elbow, of course, but you definitely want it in the front edge of the sternum area. This is it's kind of a cartoonish drawing, but this is the sternum bone. So you want to make sure that you're girthing up, in that sternum area and not behind that. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, is there any websites or something that you can really trust what you're looking at is the right information on this? Because when you look it up on the internet, it is like out in the middle of the horse's belly to
That is a really, really hard thing. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot.
And if you're trying to learn it, how do you know it's wrong?
Yes. When I am questioning something, or I have a client that's asked me something that maybe I need to research, I try to go more to the sites that have actual, for lack of a better term, scientific, backing to it. I don't want someone's opinion. All horse people have opinions, and they're all very strongly opinionated, right? So what one person says is going to be different, and there are saddle people that I see on there that aren't setting up the rigging right and everything, and it is very hard because there is an enormous amount of misinformation out there. So I try to go to sites that have actual backing, to be able to, back what they're actually saying. So, and there are a couple of sites. There's, I think it's the World Horse Health Association. Have I got that right? That's a great site, and they have a lot of good information on that site. The FEI has great information as far as for English people. But, even as far as saddle fitting, there will be, your mom and pop with, here, buy my $20 video and we'll teach you about saddle fitting or whatever. So I tell people to just, and if they're questioning anything about the lines or whatever, go back to the anatomy of the horse and look it up yourself and do your due diligence and research, as opposed to what one person is saying, which is why I love the schooling that I did, because the headmaster of the school, he worked with OBGYNs to, get all of his backing on, how a woman sits in a saddle and the problems that we have. He talked to every vet, every doctor he could to get all of his information. And that's what I really try to go back to.
So you grew up riding double and still ride double all the time. Why is a person riding double sitting?
Yeah, yep, exactly. In that lumbar area. Yep. Yep. And we've probably all done it. Yeah. So it's
But you're saying it's kind of taboo. You don't want to ride double.
it's not the best. Yeah, it's not the best.
So when you go putting saddlebags on and you're doing pack trips and you're taking most of your load,
It depends on how much weight you're putting in those saddlebags. So yeah, the strap of that saddlebag is probably sitting in the lumbar area, but it's not a, 100-pound plus person sitting there, bouncing. They might not be the best at, supporting themselves or, posting or whatever in the saddle. There's a lot of saddles that are very rear balanced. So you're sitting more to the back of the saddle, which is putting your weight even further, back on them. And so, I don't see a problem with saddlebags. I think of it more as, the person, you know, bouncing in that area. But, if we're riding double and we're walking around, it's not the best. It's not ideal, but, it's not a person that's cantering or loping and, you're not holding yourself properly. So,
So girth length, where the rings end up,
yeah.
where's that window that's
So, I ideally, I think the what I always hear is a good hand width or 6 to 8 inches from your skirting on down, and that's where you want, your rigging to sit. Um, so that latissimus is very hard for the average person to find because it requires finding the edge of your humerus bone and knowing where the humerus is and going about 2 inches down and then over. It's tricky to find. And the only way that I knew for sure that I had it right is I did a fitting with an equine vet. And I thought, if there's anybody that's going to tell me that I have this, line incorrect, it would be the vet. And they're like, nope, you're right on, but it is very hard to find. So it's a tricky one. So, any other questions about what we're talking about here? Yeah.
So if you had a hunter saddle, you would want the buckles to be more like up
Yep,
here, and then
yep.
a dressage would be more down here.
Yeah.
And Western could kind of be
Sure.
anywhere in there.
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep.
If you said it again, but slow the whole face of saying it down.
I'm sorry, what?
She covered all three.
Oh.
So up towards here would be like a hunter saddle with a long girth. Down here would be more of a dressage girth.
Yeah.
And then I think kind of anywhere in here for Western.
Yep. And it depends on how the horse is put together too. So that's part of my goal when I do a fitting, is to help you understand how your horse is put together, whether it's got, a short saddle support area, meaning, a short back, or, where its bones and muscles are, and, why we want to be on certain muscles and why we don't want to be on others. So each horse is put together. Some horses, their latissimus line will come way down here because their humerus is sitting in a different spot. So that latissimus line is going to be very different for each horse, depending on how that horse's conformation is. So, any other?
Back to my question about center fire, that front rigging should be pretty perpendicular and the other one's lying out.
Yep. Yep. If that front rigging is sitting back behind the balance point, then it gets into the same thing that I was talking about before, is that you're then no longer in the quiet spot. You're no longer in the balance point of the horse. And then you then run the risk of things loosening up or moving. So you just always want to make sure that you're getting your rigging, behind that elbow.
So is this acceptable grounds to talk mule talk?
Oh, sure.
Is a mule the center configuration?
A mule will be very similar, same principles. They have, they still have the same bones and muscles and everything. So whatever's applied to the horse will still be the mule.
I really don't get much on this.
Right. Yeah. But that's the same for horses. I mean, there are some horses that, are completely mutton withered, and there's some that are shark fin withered. So.
Okay, can you talk a minute about the blanket that goes underneath the saddle? Is there any harm in putting a blanket that doesn't completely cover? I don't know the talk on English saddles. Is that the skirting all the way at the lowest point?
So actually for an English saddles technically don't even need a pad because their panels are made to provide what our Western saddles provide, our Western pads provide. So the pad that you use for your English saddle is really only to protect the saddle from sweat, to protect your leg or your boot or your breeches from any sweat. The pad on an English saddle typically does not really give any certain support per se. The Western saddle they are not made to go directly on the horse. You'll need a pad for that. Talking about pads and the materials. Like I said, everybody's got an opinion, but my thoughts and feelings come from my schooling, and I tell all my clients that you cannot go wrong with going back to what we originally started with being either the sheepskin, the shearling, or a good wool felt pad. You just can't go wrong with them. So a horse is one of the very few animals. I think there's 2 other animals that sweat, but a horse sweats like our bodies sweat. So what I tell my clients when they're looking at either girths or pads, there's a lot of them out there that are made in a neoprene. I guarantee there's people in this room that are riding in neoprene girths. I'm not a fan of them because a horse's body, like I said, it still needs to sweat. And when you're putting the rubber, that neoprene against their skin, can you really tell yourself, can they sweat underneath this? I'm not a fan of the neoprene from what all I've learned about it. You cannot go wrong with a nice wool, or a shearling. So,
What are you saying?
a shearling like the fleece.
Yeah, but if you're out in the woods and picking up all kinds of the woods and taking it with you, what's the best girth to use?
The best girth.
Yeah, because that fleece will just tell you everything.
Yeah, yeah. Then I'd still go. My number one would be wool, and same for a pad, and then on down from there. But
So the wool is in fleece. I mean felt.
yes, yep.
Do you ever use rope girth for the Western saddles?
Sure. And they're okay. Depends on if the horse tolerates that. I mean, I rode with a rope girth, whether it was right or wrong. I don't know. I spent 25 years riding in a rope girth, and
There's some natural rope girths, right? Like mohair.
yeah, there are some mohair ones. Yep.
What are your feelings on half pads with the English saddles? Everybody has all their different padding systems,
Yes.
right? What are your thoughts?
What is half pad?
Actually, half pad is
It's like an
half
extra
of an English pad, pretty much, that gives more support
Yeah.
or changes the sizing of the saddle. There's a lot of.
Do we have any jumpers in here?
So it's like an
Okay.
extra padding in there.
Yep. So have you got one of those thin line pads?
I have, it's a neoprene one.
Okay. So I'm not a fan of those because again, if their skin needs to breathe, how is it breathing through that rubber?
With a pad underneath it even?
Yeah. I feel that their skin needs to be able to breathe. It needs to be able to sweat. The material needs to be able to absorb that. And the material can't absorb that when it's when it's the rubber, the neoprene material.
What are your thoughts on just people use it to adjust the size of the saddle?
Right.
To
And
make the saddle fit more
right.
horses, right?
And that, those half pads are kind of the same as us shimming a Western saddle. So not everybody can go out and buy a saddle, and when I do a fitting, I never, if I tell a client that their saddle, doesn't fit here, here, and here, whatever, if I see them 6 months from now, 8 months from now, or whatever, and they're still riding on that same saddle, I'm not here to judge anybody on that. It depends on what you can afford. We all want what's best for the horse. There are people that say, well, if you can't get the proper saddle, then don't ride your horse. As somebody that, since I was probably, my mother is here, she can probably attest to it. I've been a fanatic about horses since I was very, very little. And if someone said, you can't ride your horse until you get a proper saddle, I would personally struggle with that. I'd have a hard time with that answer. So, you know, I want what's best for the horse. We want what's best for our horses. It's what they deserve. It's what we owe them. But not everybody can go out and buy a new saddle. So I look at half pads and shimmings as kind of band-aiding a situation until you can get something different. Ideally, we would like our Western saddle to be able to fit without the extra shims. Sometimes you have to do shims because you still need to do a lot of maybe pole work or whatever to be able to work one of the shoulders, because most horses typically have one shoulder that's bigger than the other. Some of them are very out of balance. And sometimes you need that shim to be able to help that along until you can change that. And the same for the half pad. I truly feel that if you have, a good fitting saddle, you're probably not going to need all of that. So I kind of think of them as band-aids to help you along. They're not bad. It's just I'd hate to see them to be, a long-term permanent solution. The other hard thing about saddle fitting is that a horse's body changes just like unfortunately our bodies change as we age. And so ideally I would like people to learn the best they can about their horse, how it's put together, so that say a year from now you can then look at your horse and know that, oh, he's doing this or doing that, and you can then look at your saddle and go, I can tell it's not fitting here. What do I need to do to help this along, as far as the saddle structurally, or what do I need to do for my horse? So that's the ultimate goal, is for everybody to be able to then look at their saddles and know how they're fitting down the road. Yeah. Well, I guess that depends on all the factors, because if you change shoers, your shoeing, of the horse can change how it moves. It depends. Have you changed their nutrition and their feeding? Are you riding as much, or are you riding as little? Yeah, yep. There's unfortunately so many factors involved. Are you getting some chiropractic work that has changed how they're moving? So you need to look at all of the things that influence how a horse moves, as far as how often you then need to look at your saddle. Sometimes they can then tell us when. Yeah. And hang on one sec. They have a laundry list of things that they can tell us. And it can be as simple as, a slightly closed eye. Their nostril can ever so slightly pinch down. I tell everybody about my daughter's thoroughbred, who's very sassy and swishes her tail at everything. So it's not because her saddle is necessarily ill-fitting. She swishes her tail no matter what. But I have had clients that their horses are fine, and the minute we go into what I call the dynamic assessment, and that's where we then evaluate how the horse, the saddle, and the rider are all coming together and moving. Once a tail starts swishing, to me, then that tells me it's not comfortable with something. It's not just their ears. They have many, many ways of showing us that. So we kind of have to look at that along with what other influences have gone on through the year, that have maybe changed things for them. So I don't have an answer to your question. That was a long rambling answer.
Treehouse of Greater St. Louis, so we have a number of horses, and we were discussing, well, what's the best time that we should really look at all these horses and make sure that their saddle's still strong.
Sure. Well, in that circumstance, you probably use the horses on a regular basis, and just pretty regularly, and probably don't change a whole lot, would be my guess, as far as their feeding or anything.
No, the feeding stays the same, it's the grazing.
Yeah, yeah,
Pasture time is like.
yeah, yeah. I would probably evaluate things maybe in the spring and in the fall. Yep, yep. As long as, in your circumstance where you have a pretty regular schedule. So, yeah.
I was just bouncing off that same question. Where would you think, like, evaluating this, like, if every these anti batteries that's free hand.
Yeah.
Basically, just as much as possible.
Yeah, just take a peek at things. But like I said, they also tell us. They will let us know if something's not comfortable. So
I had a question
Yeah.
about the panels on the English saddle.
Uh-huh.
Like the Western, sometimes you like the flocking will wear out and get it reflocked, right? But what about the English saddles? I've heard different thought processes on like reflocking the English saddles. At what point is the English saddle, the panels so worn out and worn down that, will that become an issue in its being comfortable on the horse?
Sure, it can, but you should be able to feel that with your fingers too. You want it to be able to have a little bit of a give. You don't want it to be completely squished, because then it's defeated its purpose, and its purpose is to give the support to the horse. So once it then loses that, you should be able to then have it reflocked, as long as you have someone that's properly doing it. And that is hard in this area. People have asked me about whether I do that, and I'm pretty particular about that, because I got my certification and my schooling for a reason, as opposed to the Joe Schmo online learning way. And I feel that if you're going to reflock or adjust a saddle, I think you should have gone to. I think there's a saddlery school out in Maryland that I've looked into, but I really think you should have the experience and know what you're doing, because people can really screw up that flocking.
So do you have a resource?
I do not, and that's what's I'm really glad that I'm here for us in the area, but I wish to God I wish we had somebody in the area that did that, and I don't believe we do.
So tenting a saddle blanket when you're putting it under your saddle. Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah. I'm mixed on that, because some people just swear by doing that. I personally don't know that I find it completely necessary. And there are times when, if you're tenting it, it could then buckle, potentially cause blistering or whatever. If you have a horse that's not mutton withered, if you have a horse that has any sort of withers to it, I would presume that you're going to have a pad that has the curved relief to it. So, if someone could tell me a really logical reason as to why they then pull it even farther up into the girth, I'd love to hear that. Not to question you, but I'd love to hear somebody's theory on why they feel that that's necessary to do. Because if if you've got a mutton withered horse, then of course you're going to have a pad that doesn't have that relief to it. But if the pad already has that curved relief, then why do you need to do that?
So I bought a blanket. It's felt. The main blanket is felt, about I don't know, an inch thick. And it's like they cut the middle of it and they put little straps. So it's like two square pieces. I didn't know if that was sort of like the built-in tenting potential, and I wasn't sure.
It's just one of the ways that manufacturers have done that, and I'd be careful on those, because sometimes that one I would want to make sure, not necessarily to tent it, but I would want to make sure that it wasn't tight down onto the withers, because sometimes when they have that extra strap that's on the top there, that leather strap can actually then start pulling down on the top of their wither, and it's working against you.
Yeah, it seems like, I don't know for sure because I bought it used, and it seems like it could stretch, and then
Yeah, probably so. I would just keep a very close eye on how it's sitting on the top of the withers. Same for bareback pads. I know we're not talking about bareback pads, but there are bareback pads that have the strap that goes over the top of it, and that can be just as bad for the horse, because it's a strap that's actually pulling. Yep, it's actually pulling on the top of the withers, and that's not great for it. So.
I had a question about saddle trees.
Yes.
The difference between flex tree
versus wooden trees, weight distribution? Is there a weight limit for flex trees? As someone who, like, we just did 50 miles this weekend endurance ride, and my horse got very sore back because the dressage saddle I was riding in did not provide enough weight distribution.
So yes, from the get-go, that is one of the most important things that I check for when I do a fitting, and it's a pretty simple test. So I'll take these cheap hotel pens that I have and stick it upright under the saddle, right about, on your D-ring area, and I take that pen without lifting the saddle up, because once you lift it up, then you're messing up, and take that pen and slide it along their back, and you should have a pretty good even contact with that pen, all the way from front to back. If you hit a spot where all of a sudden the pen slides, then you're missing contact there, or you can actually get to a point where your pen doesn't even want to move anymore, and then you've got way too much contact. So it's a part of what I do for the fitting for the English and the Western, because it is imperative that our weight is distributed in that saddle support area between that scapula and there. Kind of the same, it's the same principle that back in the Civil War, the saddles that they used back then was exactly that. It sat in that exact area. It had a cutout at the top. It was a great little saddle, probably not very comfortable for them, but as far as distributing their weight on the horse and the comfort for the horse, it was perfect. And for whatever reason, manufacturers have completely lost sight of that. The treeless saddles, I'm kind of iffy on those, because my theory is there's a reason why those trees were developed all those years ago, and that tree is there to support our weight on their back. And if our weight is not evenly distributed, then we're causing them pain or pressure in either the front, the middle, the back, wherever, and it's not distributing it. Sometimes I think of, if somebody is going to stand on your foot, step on your foot, and they're in a high heel shoe, or you've got another gal who's got a nice little espadrille or a wedge on, I'm going to choose that espadrille or wedge, because that's going to then take her weight and spread it out. If you've got, a high heel, boy, you got a complete pinpoint on two ends. And so, did I answer your question on that? Kind of, sort of, yeah. As far as
Because, like, for my saddle, the way it was described to me by the vet this weekend is the saddle I had was designed so that most of the weight was, like, right behind the shoulders. The weight wasn't distributed very far back along the tree, just the way the tree was designed. Whereas, like, your Western saddles or endurance saddles with the wooden trees, like you said about I'm assuming the
yeah,
are designed to distribute the weight further along this.
Yeah. So if your saddle is putting more of your weight in the front, that's probably a lot harder on her shoulder to move, and probably made her, sore after that many miles. Yeah. Dan.
When, as you know, we do saddle trials, so people are taking saddle down all the time, testing them out, and it's a fairly short window of time to assess a saddle. What kind of recommendation do you have for someone when you're going to take the saddle out and you're going to try it on your horse for a little while? You're not going to take it out for hours on a trail ride. What should they be looking for? Suggestions what they should look for?
So there is one trick, and it's their sweat patterns are really good. And in this kind of weather that we are now having in wonderful St. Louis, that's pretty easy to do. So you can work the horse just a little bit, and then very gently take the saddle off, but then lift up your blanket. Don't pull your blanket down. Lift up your blanket. Look at the sweat patterns that the saddle has left on the horse, and see if there's an even sweat pattern. Sometimes even in the fall and winter, you can even see there's plenty of dust and dirt on them, that the dust and dirt will settle into spots as well, similar to the sweat patterns. So that's one way to be able to look at it.
And you
And-
want to see a full imprint of where it makes contact? Is that what
Yep,
you're
yep.
doing?
You don't typically want to see dry spots. When you're seeing dry spots, especially if you're on a, on a long ride, you finished up your ride and you pull off your saddle and you've got, a dry spot, say behind the wither, behind that scapula. It doesn't take much pressure for their skin to then lose the ability to sweat. And once those capillaries then start to die off, then that's how we then end up then with the white hair pattern, because the
So
capillaries
dry
have
spot is being caused by putting
way too much pressure, way too much pressure. Yep.
Too narrow of a tree, at times.
Can be, but and too wide of a saddle can cause just as bad of pressure as too narrow. Yep. Yep. Yeah, exactly. If you have too wide of a tree, then what it's doing is the gullet, if it's too wide, then it's actually then sitting down on their withers. And then it's then probably at the top part of their scapula, it's putting a lot of extra pressure where the majority of the weight of that saddle is then sitting.
So if you have a old horse, is it important to have a blanket that's built up in the front where they're never gonna build that front profile back again? You know, I'm asking.
Yeah, are you talking about swayback or are you talking about like the shoulder holes?
What do you
Like
call it?
shoulder holes?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
think it's more of a shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that, it's not a padded saddle, but it's definitely a thicker in the front where they just kind of lost their body mass.
Sure. Yeah.
Shoulder hole. Is that what you would recommend for an old horse?
I more than anything, I would make sure that yes, the padding would help with it, but more importantly, I would make sure that that tree angle works with their shoulder. Once they, and I just had somebody that had a horse that had foundered, so it's got, front hoof issues, and she will struggle to probably ever build up a good top line and, good shoulders on that poor horse. And so it's much harder to fit saddles when when you might not even have that ability, or they're too old, or they have health reasons to not be able to then build that up. So it's kind of a combination of making sure that the tree is fitting those shoulder angles and, the width, and then getting a nice pad to be able to give them that support. Yeah. Did I answer your question fully? Okay. Awesome.
So assuming that you, I mean, obviously at some point you're probably gonna be buying another saddle, what are, people come in and walk in and they need a saddle, and they come from you, they're probably gonna come with cutouts, the angles that you're looking for. What are the steps that they should look, things they maybe should communicate to the person they're working with, or the steps that you should be expecting to go through as you're selecting the saddle to take out and try on your horse?
And they haven't done a fitting with me, you mean? Just a general person? If they don't, if they don't have tracings or anything, of the horse, then the best thing, I mean, Elizabeth, you'd even be able to probably answer that just as well. You need to know about, the horse and, what its withers are like, and do they have any ideas at a longer back, shorter back? But again, it also goes into, what fits them as well. So, yep, the rider themselves, and it's imperative that they're then sitting in that saddle, which we haven't even gotten to that yet. I kind of forgot about that part. So,
I think that's the process that we all typically go through is what's the style of riding you're doing first, start narrowing it from there, start looking at the size of seat and what fits
Yep.
you and what's comfortable, and narrow it down, and then it's a matter of taking 1 or 2 or 3 out to try on your horse.
Yep. That seat size is the seat size is really important. So, kind of a rule of thumb is, especially on the Western saddle, you'd like about a thumb width between your inner thigh. You go with 2 fingers. Okay. never go below, a thumb width between the front of your thigh and that pommel. And then we need to then also still talk about what's called the chair seat position, which is what a lot of Western saddles made for men put us women in a total chair seat position. So it's really important that we're getting our shoulders, our hips, and our heels balanced as best we can. Because then, like I said before, when we're in balance, then it helps the horse also be in balance. Our balance point is also our sternum, just like the horse. So if you think about the jockeys that are at the Kentucky Derby, no matter how low those guys go, their sternum always stays in line with the ball of their feet. So, and we need to keep also in line with the horse's sternum. So, and if we are sitting in a chair seat position, you're more than likely going to be probably hunched over in your seat, because what feels natural to you is actually kind of putting your sternum more to the ball of your feet and getting you maybe feeling a little more balanced. And it's horribly uncomfortable for the women to be sitting in that chair seat. If you're riding English, it's pretty impossible to, do any posting, when you're sitting in a chair seat position. So, and a lot of the Western saddles, English can also be that way, but on a Western saddle, the twist of a saddle is where our inner thighs are. And the twist, if you can take your fingers on the seams of a Western saddle, and if your fingers are completely spread from one seam to the other, then that right there is telling you that that saddle's made more for a man. A man needs a much wider twist than what we do. When a woman sits in a saddle that has too wide of a twist, it's actually pushing our hips out. And when our hips get pushed out, it's pushing our knees out. And when our knees are pushed out, we're then completely out of balance. And when you then say, I went on a 10-mile ride today and my hips and my knees are killing me, you're probably sitting in too wide of a twist.
Can you tip that saddle up and try to sit it on that?
Yep. So the twist is going to be right here, about where your inner thighs sit. So when you're touching from seam to seam and your fingers are completely spread out, this one's pretty wide. Ideally, I'd probably, for a woman, I'd like it to be a bit more narrow. But when your fingers are spread out as almost as far as they can go, it's too wide of a twist, and it will end up pushing your hips and your knees out.
More like this instead of-
Yep. Yep. Sure. So same thing for the English. The twist area is going to be right about here. And, the English saddles aren't too bad as far as that. What ends up being more different on an English saddle is our stirrup leathers. Same for the Western saddle. A man needs their fenders and their stirrup leathers to be farther out, and a woman needs them to be a little bit more back. So the way a man sits in the saddle, what will put us into a chair seat position ends up putting them in the perfect position where they need to be. So our stirrup leathers on the English saddle need to be a little bit more back.
Wait. They go underneath that spot where they cut. So you
Yep.
can move them further back somehow?
Some saddles you can, a lot of saddles you can't.
That's the one shot.
Yep.
Can you buy any extender to slide over it to?
I am not aware of that. I think it's going to be more the manufacturer and how you sit in the saddle, and that's why it is imperative to sit in it. Have somebody, a friend, somebody in the store or whatever, take a picture of you. It's not how cute you look sitting in the saddle, it's how you sit in the saddle. Does it have you, well balanced? How's that saddle fitting you?
How do you know where that spot is on an English?
It's going to be where your inner thighs are.
How about where you spread your thumbs and
Yep.
fingertips?
Yep.
Is it just
Once you
halfway down the slope?
Well, it's when you sit on it, you'll know where your about where your inner thighs are. Yep, yep, yep. What other questions?
So is there any way to measure how far or close or up front the attachment point for the stirrups are?
Measuring? No.
Because like on a Western, everybody can see. So like, it's right here. That's where it's
Yep.
coming.
Right.
Is there any like typical saddle sale language that people use for to like be a little bit further back?
No, not necessarily. And unfortunately, I've looked at so many of them that I can kind of look at them and see that the fender is a little more forward or a little bit more back. But it's just going to require the rider to just sit in the saddle, see how the seat is. Because the other thing that affects you is how the seat is balanced and the shape of our rear end and the shape of everything else. Does it give you the proper support in the back? Is it, and especially even in the English, the back of it can sometimes rotate your pelvis too far forward. It really is. I can't stress enough how important it is to sit in the saddle, wiggle around, find that spot. Don't try to force your legs or anything. Find your sweet spot of sitting in that saddle and then determine, am I balanced? How does this feel? Do I feel like it's pitching me forward? Am I slouched back? So you're just going to have to sit in it. So
One of my questions, like kind of with the English saddle, is you talk about there's a lot more play front to back, like finding the balance
Yeah.
between the seat and stuff.
Yep.
Knowing fitting, like you want the saddle balance, but the sweet spots on the horse. How do you know, like if it fits the shoulders, but what if the back end of the saddle doesn't sit quite right?
A lot of that will then also depend on if the gullet size and the angles are fitting it properly. And always keep in mind that there's a back end to the trees as well. So the angles of the trees in the back are important as well. So it needs to, follow along with the rump of the horse on the back. If the saddle is not sitting balanced on the horse to where, your pommel and your cantle, whether it's English or Western, you want them to be sitting level on the horse. And if it's not, something with the fit of that saddle is not working with the horse. So some do, yep, but you'll still be able to look at the saddle and you'll be able to tell whether it's, sitting too, I mean, that's completely exaggerated, but you'll be able to see whether it's sitting level on the horse.
So if you have an animal that's very high on that back end of their spine, they're like this pretty much.
Sure, sure. You're just going to have to take that into consideration and still look at the saddle.
I mean, would you have a built-up pad in the front?
No, because if the horse is a completely downhill shape, then you're just going to have to accommodate their downhill. You can't then build the saddle up to then make it level, but it's not like you're going to be sitting on the Screaming Eagle either. So
you're saying you want the saddle to match the back of the horse and be a little downhill for that particular horse?
sure, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. You want it.
It's symmetrical for their back, no matter.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. One factor that I forgot to mention, which is why this saddle is so important for me to bring to things. Western saddles, we typically don't have to worry about it. Western saddles are always made with a really nice wide gullet from the front to the back. And the gullet it goes back to when I originally talked about the spine and the two little muscles that run on each side of that spine, and that it's imperative that we're not sitting on those two little muscles, the multifidus muscles that run alongside of the spine, and that we're sitting on that longissimus muscle. Western saddles almost always do that. Western saddles are awesome that way. They just come that way. Our English saddles can be actually little torture devices. And I don't know why. There are some manufacturers that are still producing saddles this way. This saddle happens to be nice and wide in the front and completely narrows down to the back, which makes zero sense whatsoever because a horse's muscles go straight parallel, just like a railroad track from front to back. They don't narrow to the back. When you narrow to the back, then you're now sitting on those muscles we don't want to be sitting on, and you're causing them terrible pain sitting on those muscles. So on an English saddle, you always want to make sure that you can get a good fist width from the front of the saddle all the way to the back. Some of them can actually even be way too wide in the front, which then actually then kind of puts you off from that longissimus muscle, kind of defeating the purpose again. So there is a possibility of them even being too wide. So just always make sure that your English saddles have a really good gullet clearance. So
One thing that I saw, I was trying a different saddle on one of my horses, and it seemed like it fit well on the shoulders. But then when the one rider was sitting in it and riding, the back of the saddle was kind of, it wasn't like twisting side to side, but it looked like it got a little bit of air.
on the back side, yeah.
What does that tell you about the fit of the saddle?
That yes, that it's rocking. So I would be very curious is, God, one other really important factor. When you're looking at saddles, don't ever put a pad on underneath. Don't ever. English or Western. It's kind of, I go back to the jeans analogy. It's kind of like putting on, a pair of leggings or thermal underwear or whatever, and then trying on a pair of jeans. You can't tell how they're truly going to fit if you've got another layer on. So always make sure that you are looking at a saddle without the pad on so you can see how the saddle truly fits the horse. And then don't cinch it down. It changes the dynamic of the saddle. That way you're able to really see how those angles and everything are working. Jesus, I just lost my train of thought. The rocking. So yes. So if sorry, I'm getting old. So if you don't have the pad on, take the rider off, put the saddle on, I would be very curious to take that pen and run it along and see if you're having good contact near the front and then you start losing the contact. I'm going to guess that the back end of that tree is probably is not fitting. Sometimes the back end of that tree can be too narrow and can sit up. And it could very well be too wide as well. So
Could that be an issue? I call it like banana panels.
yes. And sometimes you can have a horse that has a really nice, not necessarily a flat back, but sometimes the English saddles can have way too much, already, if you flip it over and if you're looking at it, it can have an enormous amount of rock to it. And if that is not fitting the shape of your horse's back, I just had one of those this last weekend that the saddle had way too much rock built into it, and it was a really flat-backed horse, and it had enormous amount of pressure in the center, and it was kicked up in the back, and so it wasn't evenly displacing everything. So
Maybe walk through what a normal fitting would look like. When you set a saddle on your horse's back, what are things you as a fitter are looking for, like a rock and the twisting motion and
sure. So first I do the mapping on the horse, then I typically look at the saddle on my saddle stand to kind of evaluate the saddle on how the saddle is put together. Then I like the rider to then sit in the saddle to then see how they're sitting in the saddle. Then I typically then put the saddle up on the horse. And then once it goes up on the horse, yeah, I typically start with the front. I'll look at the angles to see how the angle is, what kind of wither clearance we've got up at the top. Feel along the panel, or the tree, whichever you're looking at. Make sure you have a good even contact front to back. See how long it is, whether it's extending into that lumbar area. I look at the rigging, how far back is that rigging sitting? Every manufacturer is a little bit different, and because the horses are all built different, you could have a saddle that has a rigging really far back, and it might work for one horse, but it's going to be way too far back, and you're going to have, you're going to be cinching up, at a really awkward angle. You look at the balance of the saddle to see if it's sitting level on the horse. But that, sliding the pen underneath it to see how your contact is from front to back, from concho to under the cantle. Making sure, sometimes if you've got an older Western saddle, that skirting can be the old squared off skirting. And we've got a lot of short backed horses now these days, and that skirting can be, right up against the hip bone, and it's too long. A lot of newer saddles are made with more of a, a rounded skirting on them. It seems to be more of the trend now. So, in general, that's, what I look for when it's then on the horse. Same if I have a client that then is trialing a saddle from Golden Horseshoe, I want to see a full side view to see, is it sitting too, is it placed too far forward? Is it sitting balanced? How is it from that full side view to then also then get a back view to see how it's fitting on the back end, because that's just as important. But then it's also important to look at both shoulders, because like I said, shoulders are typically pretty uneven, to varying degrees. So if you check one shoulder, always look at the other shoulder as well. One will probably, fit different than the other. So
What do you do in that case? Like if the shoulder's fairly uneven, what's your solution? Because saddles are supposed to be symmetrical.
right. Then that goes back to either exercises. There's a lot of, ground pole work that you can do to, build up one of the shoulders if you've got the time and the ability to be able to do that. Or, there's a lot of exercises that you can do to build that up. Or if, like we talked about before, if the horse has health issues or due to age or whatever, that you're not able to get them to actually physically make that change, then yeah, you're going to have to, band-aid it with, some extra pads or, shimming to help that.
So if you have a saddle that's called a trooper, it's kind of like the Tuckers, but it was its own brand, and it has two felt pads underneath instead of sheepskin stuff. And it's like two ovals going down the length of the animal. Can that pen trick work? Just throw it underneath and test
You should still be able to do that with that felt. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but yeah.
So I'm starting to see a lot of different saddles with that kind of build.
Yeah, just like the Tuckers have that. Yep.
Do you have any problems with orthoflex where the panels move with the animal? As long as when it's just sitting on it, kind of
That kind of goes into a little bit of the same vein of treeless saddles. It's, is it?
they are considered treeless.
Not necessarily, no, but the true treeless saddles, it's kind of the same. My only thing is it able to evenly distribute your weight? That's the question you need to ask yourself. Anybody else have any other questions?
I have a Hidalgo, and it has a leather tree saddle. I use leather tree. So I guess it has a little bit of flex to it, but it's an actual tree still in the saddle.
Yeah.
That's not the one I normally use, though.
Yeah.
So when they say leather tree, is it a wooden tree wrapped in leather, or is it?
No, it's like a hard leather.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're supposedly, they allow the horse's back to flex.
Yeah.
Wasn't the leather tree saddles specific made for the animal? So that's how.
I don't know the background on them, honestly. It's something I'd have to research.
Yeah, I do, my panels are movable. They're Velcro, and that you can adjust them to different horses.
Oh, okay, okay,
So,
okay.
So the leather tree is obviously in the saddle, but the panels, can be moved around.
Okay.
And actually, the person who represents them in the area, she came out and kind of did the same thing.
Okay.
And endured
Yeah, awesome.
I have a different horse now, and it has been on.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
I would say, kind of echo something you said from our perspective, if you come in with a saddle condition concern, whatever, we love to see photos and videos, of the horse moving, maybe riding the horse, those types of things, it really helps our team kind of understand what's going on. And we love the pictures of your horse to see how pretty the horse is, but we're really looking for more details in the movement of it.
So I would say, without interrupting you, I would say that's the final part of saddle fitting that I think is probably the most important. And I very rarely get to do it because the saddle typically doesn't fit. And when the saddle is showing me that it's not fitting, then what's the point of me putting the horse through that? But what I call the dynamic assessment is I like to see the horse move, lunging, walk, trot, canter, just very, one circle, simple circle each direction. So I get a baseline on how it moves, back to my daughter's sassy horse who will swish her tail the entire time. It kind of gives me a baseline on their antics and the things that they do and what's standard for them. Then to have the rider tack up and get on the horse and see how all three come together, because the horse will then show us, potentially more. If we think the saddle's fitting right, there might be a chance that there's something about it that he doesn't like. And once you then do the dynamic assessment to see how all three are coming together, they'll then be able to then tell you. So I think I read recently that, there's people that can, do horse whispering and talking to horses, but, are they listening to them? And that's what I think is so important, is to listen to our horse. I think you and the Blue mentioned something before we even started, about doing a possible lecture on behavior and things. Just as a very side note, I don't know if you've read the book, Horse Brain, Human Brain. Okay, highly recommend it. It gets very technical, but it's a really cool book. And it talks about how different our brain functions to their brain and how they relate, how they see things and everything. So I think I ordered mine on Amazon, and it was pretty
the St. Louis
reasonable.
Public Library, I've already looked into this, does not have that book. But if you
Okay.
go to YouTube, you can get an audiobook
Okay.
of all the different chapters.
Okay. It's a great book.
What was the name again?
Horse Brain, or do I have it backwards? It's Horse Brain, Human Brain, or vice versa. I don't remember which way it is, but it's a great book.
For him. The Golden Horseshoe, thank you for putting this on, number one, but if we take a saddle to try, you recommend I guess this is when it's cinched on and ride a little bit. That's obviously with a blanket under it.
Correct. Yep.
And it
Yep.
doesn't really matter. Use a blanket that we think is the blanket that's going to be for that saddle, right?
Yeah. But you guys have a limit. What is your limit for actually riding in the saddle when they're trialing it? Isn't it like 20 minutes to a half hour or something? Yeah.
Mostly we're looking to, I mean, if you're going to be riding in the saddle, we ask that it not be, a long trail ride for, an entire hour long lesson or something like that. Typically we have found that, 20-ish, 30-ish minutes. Because really what we're asking is that you do that dynamic portion, right?
Yep.
The dynamic, when Cindy has the dynamic part of her saddle fitting, it's not an hour long dynamic ride.
You can usually, I think, tell pretty well 5-10 minutes.
That's a bit, you can see it right
Yeah,
off the bat.
yeah.
It's 20 minutes and you should, especially in this weather, you can get that sweat pattern. You can feel like, is it bouncing? Do I have air in the back? Is it rocking? Sitting, we have two molds in the store, so any saddle that you do want to take on a trial, we highly recommend you sit in it first. We are happy to pull them down and put them on the stand for you to actually try them out and sit in them. But the reality is that those molds may not be the same as your horse. Like we've got one that's got some crazy high withers, and that's not your horse. It's not a mold of your horse. So it's really just being able to see if you fit and seeing where you line up on it. If you then put it on your horse and it's totally out of whack, like you're gonna know relatively quickly.
In the past, I brought my horse to your place, and luckily somebody was free to come out to the thing to test different ones. We've already took it home. Is that like taboo? You don't want to do that kind of
No. It's not taboo. There are limits to it. One is I would recommend making an appointment because we want to make sure they have somebody. If you won't be there and staff for that, it's not going to go. Oh, I don't know. But we want somebody who has experience for it. And we don't have, unfortunately, our facility, not like a big enough facility yet to have like a round pen or yet to make that happen. So there is.
You had a question.
For that. But yeah, just say, hey, I want to have some. I want to bring the horse in or a couple horses in, and we'll make an appointment. We'll make sure somebody's there to help you out.
But you can sure tell a lot if you sat in the store on the saddle thing and then you walk and put it on the horse. It's like it's not the right saddle.
100%.
You had a question.
Yeah, so if you came out and did a fitting and did measurements and stuff, and let's say you came to look at my husband's horse and, if he said, I want a saddle that makes me feel like this, would you be able to recommend ones that he should try? Are you familiar enough with different brands?
Yeah,
That you could say, this brand might be good for you, or this brand might be good for you.
yeah, and it might,
For me.
it also depends on, does he, he's probably not going to want to sit in a little barrel saddle, but, does he want like a Western pleasure seat? Does he want a cutting seat? And, it's not necessarily the discipline that he's actually going to do, but, that the style of the saddle, not necessarily the specific manufacturer. So, and that was the one thing I was going to, I probably should have said in the beginning. I'm not a saddle rep. I'm not here to sell cars. I'm here to help you learn about your horse. I will do everything I can to research saddles if there's one that you ask me about. But I'm not real big on promoting one saddle brand over another because there's so many factors. It depends on what someone can afford and what works for them. And so.
We get comments already if you were a little bit late, but just as a starting point, are there specific measurements you would take before even going to the saddle? Because like you won't even know what to try if you get.
Yeah, you'll definitely need to kind of have a good general on if you can do your own tracings or whatever, but to be able to know, the tracing, for a lack of a better word, for, their shoulder, and then how long, like what I call their saddle support area between that scapula and that 18th rib is really important because then that dictates, how big of a saddle you can actually go with. So those are really important dimensions. Yep. So before we end up, I wanted to bring out my cute picture again and see, now that we've talked about some things, there's two really, really glaringly obvious things. So there's a few of them. Yes, that's one of them. Yep. It's a cute picture, right? So even if my cute little daughter were not sitting in front of me, I would still be sitting in a very chair seat position, even without her sitting there. And I sat in that chair seat position for a lot of years and sat always very slouched over in my saddle. It was just totally wrong saddle for me to be sitting in. And the other one that's a little hard to see is where I have my cinch. My cinch is way, way back there. What the hell I was doing, I have no idea. It's probably because of the rigging, and that's just where I decided to put it. And I also don't have a connector strap between my front and my back. And I do know at one time I was sent over, flying over the top of his head because that back strap went up into his flank. So these were some really hard lessons learned back in these days. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really hard to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd have to look at it again.
As far as stirrups and not being in the saddle, if you got on a saddle and just like pretended you were bareback in the saddle and just let your legs straight down,
Mhm.
would that be where your stirrups should be?
So they say that for English, right? That you want your stirrup to be hitting at your ankle bone.
Which part of the stirrup? The bottom.
Yeah,
But that's gonna depend if you're doing jumping
correct.
or dressage.
Exactly. Yeah, it depends on the discipline as well. So are you referring to Western more specifically, or?
Just generally. But let's just say Western.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there is a specific standard. I think it's what's, your comfort level, how you're sitting in the saddle. I had someone recently that was sitting in a saddle, and I'm like, "Is this where you always have your stirrup?" And she said, "Yeah." And it was a Western saddle, and her leg was bent way, way up. And I was like, just do me a favor, and next time you ride, put it at least one hole down and see how it feels. So do you have something to add to that?
That when you're standing and you're in alignment, you should just barely see your toe.
Yeah.
So when you get in the saddle, that's how you should line your legs up.
Oh.
And that's where your stirrup should go for Western.
Okay.
So that your legs aren't hanging down, but they're not up in like a jockey
Yeah.
style.
Yep.
So
Yep.
You stand in your stirrups.
Yeah.
And just sit straight
sit
down.
straight down. You're probably about this much between you and the seats.
Yeah.
Too much, and you're too short, right?
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions? Do we all have horses we have to worry about going home?
I got questions, but I don't know that anybody else cares about them. It's how the breast strip should fit and croupers and bridges.
Oh,
So I don't know if anybody cares about that stuff. Oh, yes.
that I can't answer to. Sorry. Do you have thoughts on that? No, I'm looking at you. Yeah, you.
Yes.
Oh, tell her.
So can you point on that Palomino thing there?
So it depends on where your knees are. Breast strap is going to be about here, and it's going to come down right in the angle of the shoulder. You don't want it down here. You don't want it up there. You want to follow the angle of the shoulder so that you've got enough strap to come underneath. If it's too far down, it doesn't do anything to keep the saddle in place. If it's too far up, your head can't drop, and you're going to be choking your horse. So right along the angle of the shoulder is where your breast piece should sit.
Okay, do you want to tackle croupers?
Never used one. I can tell you that on your back, when your crupper fits, it should just touch under the tail. It shouldn't pull the tail up. It shouldn't be hanging down.
Mm-hmm.
When you come up to the back of the saddle, there's your ring. When it's adjusted, it should not be loose, but it shouldn't be tight. It should just have a little bit of tension. Too tight, you make the mule too uncomfortable.
So this is the mule's tail coming out. Should you have a little gap underneath? Or
About
should it
this
touch?
much. About this much. Yeah, not like this, and not up hard, because the mule will tell you they're uncomfortable with that.
And then bridging is just a matter of
You have to mess with that, yeah. And that I don't know anything about.
thank you.
Are we good?
I have one question.
One quick one. Okay.
So before all of this, when you're looking to buy a horse, if you could make the best confirmation, do you want like this line to kind of match with the girth placement, or like how forward? Back?
So they can,
'Cause they come
and
in
that's
all shapes and
but that's
sizes.
going to change. Their shoulder, that's going to change.
When they're standing square.
Right. But if you work him a lot or work him less, that's an ever-changing line. That line's not just because this horse, it's here today. So if she's worked a lot and she builds up, that line's going to move. It's not going to stay there. So it doesn't really matter whether she has an upright, normal, or a sloped shoulder in comparison to her balance point, because that's going to change as she changes. So she won't always necessarily be in that same line. Okay, are we good? Any other questions? Hopefully this was all helpful to some degree to everybody. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. I think that's great. And hopefully everybody learned a little something tonight and can take away something from this. So